Welcome to the CEC Report for the 19th of February 2016. I'm Elisa Barwick and joining me today is Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Elisa.
On today's show, Glass-Steagall rises as bank shares sink, and the derivatives casino dealers who cooked up bail-in. So firstly, Glass-Steagall rises as bank shares sink. So for people who've been following our programs and the news, it's obvious that we are in a banking meltdown since the beginning of 2016. The Economist provided a roundup of the losses since January the 1st, about a week ago these figures are at. The US bank shares have lost 13%, Japan 36%, Italy 31%, and Greece a whopping 60%. Now, Australian bank shares have been plummeting as well. Macquarie bank shares have lost 30% this year, ANZ 21%, Westpac 16%, and the NAB and CBA both 14%.
And Elisa, the biggest exposure of most Australians' super funds in terms of their investments would be to those four banks.
And the week that CBA announced this record profit of $4.2 billion for a half year, that same week, $25 billion was wiped off the big four banks just in 1 week. So that was one point that was made about the ridiculousness of these massive profits. Of course, not to mention what's going on in the background that's causing all this, which we'll discuss in the show. Other banks, you can see the effect because, for example, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, bought $26 million worth of his own bank shares in 1 day after it fell to the lowest level in 2 years. The former Bank of England chief economist and the head of the Commission on Banking, Sir John Vickers, has also come out saying that British banks are vulnerable to external shocks. So it's not just the Deutsche Banks and the other European banks that are in trouble. Standard Chartered has lost, its shares are at 25-year lows, a quarter century, and HSBC shares are down to 2009 levels. Now, the Nikkei News of Japan put its finger on the nub of the issue here, where they had a headline on the 10th of February, touchy derivatives market spreading Deutsche Bank waves. And that article warned that the derivatives market is the issue. The derivatives are acting, they put it, as a fire accelerator within the growing fire of an ongoing bank panic, because it's obvious that the derivatives exposure since 2007, 2008 has not reduced, and the same issue which caused that problem is even worse than what it was. There's also a huge pile-in to credit default swaps in the riskiest banks such as Deutsche Bank, UBS and Citibank, even as their prices shoot up. So this is people buying risk insurance, insuring themselves against the defaults of the banks in which they're invested. So the price of those is lawfully going up, but people are piling in nonetheless.
And we discussed this last week, how that phenomenon there of people piling into credit default swaps is very similar to when in 2007, as the movie The Big Short illustrates, where people realised the initial guys who betted against the market were right, who bet against the market were right, and a lot of people and a lot of Wall Street banks piled into the same credit default swaps. The same thing is happening now. Deutsche Bank is widely acknowledged to be the biggest trouble bank in the world, and lawfully so because it's got the biggest derivatives exposure of any bank in the world. The other European bank that's in real deep trouble is Credit Suisse First Boston, which is plummeting like Citibank. And when they call it a fire accelerator, Lisa, the way these derivatives work, they're a lot more exotic and they're a lot more complicated, but it's no real different to the old margin call that caused the 1929 and 1987 stock market collapses. So someone borrows money to buy shares, and the bank knows that they've put that money, they've lent them into shares, right? So that person can have a lot more shares than they'd otherwise be able to afford. But the bank has this policy of a margin call that if the value of the shares they buy fall below a certain amount, they have to pay the bank their money back. And people would have to sell with wherever the market was. If they got a margin call, they have to sell, and they have to sell quickly because the bank wanted their money back. And of course, that would take an initial crash and just accelerate it no end. and that's where these big crashes in history came from. Derivatives are the same. It's all about leverage, right? And they spread that leverage throughout the system, and it's quite an insightful comment by Nick News.
And this is causing a general climate, though. You know, people have been through the GFC and they're seeing this again, and people are recognising the signs in the average population as well as various commentators. But we see this in the US election, for example, where it's a completely unpredictable situation. Bernie Sanders defeated Hillary Clinton by 22% in the New Hampshire primary. You had Donald Trump more than 19% ahead of his closest contender.
And we call it the mass strike, right? So you get periods like this where people say enough is enough. Now, the way they say it is not perfect. They're kind of at the mercy of the people who can, how well qualified are the people who rise up to lead them, right? But that's definitely what's happening in the States. In Bernie Sanders' case, it's explicit. His whole campaign is based on taking up the fight to Wall Street, right? That's what he says. You know, we'll see how genuine he is in the long term, but that's what he says. People are responding to that.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, funnily enough, is exuding a similar message, not in the same language. He's the charlatan on the right who's come in and, you know, he's the kind of guy who's doing the typical thing. Oh, yes, you're in deep trouble. It's those immigrants fighting the border that's the problem. But mark my words, people listen to that because yes, they're in deep trouble, right? And also, in a funny way, he himself is taking no money from Wall Street because he doesn't have to. He's a billionaire, so he's proud to say that. Bernie Sanders is taking no money from Wall Street because all these ordinary people are giving it to him. Donald Trump's saying, "I'm funding this myself," right? It sends the same message, and people are going, well, we don't want politicians who are beholden to Wall Street. Now,
Yeah,
Donald
Washington
Trump,
insiders as well.
Yep, even the Pope's had to take Donald Trump on, but we're not talking about, we're not endorsing who these candidates are. What we're saying is what the reason the people are voting like they are is a mass strike. They're sick of this system.
We've seen a similar effect in the United Kingdom with the shift inside the Labor Party moving back to the older style Labor, pre-Blair days.
Well, when Jeremy Corbyn's had this enormous success, first, no one predicted he'd get elected to be the leader, then he did. And he's broken everyone's predictions because they were wrong, because the people making these predictions want to ignore that the population feel the same way in the UK as they do in the US, and frankly, as they do here.
And there's a big debate, there's been a debate the last 48 hours in the Italian Parliament over bail-in, where various politicians are speaking out against the European-wide bail-in laws, the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive that came in on the 1st of this year, of January. And they've actually voted to review it early. There was a push to actually suspend it altogether, but that hasn't succeeded yet. But a number of the politicians there, and you can read more about it in our Australian Alert Service, but we're actually talking about the necessity for Glass-Steagall and how very simple it would be to actually deal with this problem, referring to the fact that before Glass-Steagall was gotten rid of, that there wasn't any need for bail-in. Now, also in the banking world, there's a shift. You had the head of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve in the United States, Neil Kashkari. He came out in a speech this week at the Brookings Institute saying, look, the Wall Street banks are going to be bailed in again, so we have to break up the banks. And this guy's a former Goldman Sachs executive, and he also ran the TARP fund, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was the bailout in 2008.
So he's not some lefty radical who's come along to say we're going to do this. He's an insider, but there's a number of these insiders, Elisa, who are just realistic about where things are at, and they're prepared to go back to a system that works rather than see the world, go down in flames, or the economic world go down in flames.
But this mass strike potential was pointed out explicitly by Alistair Heath, who's the deputy editor of the London Telegraph, and I just want to quote what he had to say on the 10th of February. He said, "We are too fragile, fiscally as well as psychologically. Another collapse would trigger a cataclysmic, uncontrollable backlash. The public," he said, "whose faith in elites and the private sector was rattled after 2007-09, would simply not wear it. Its anger would be so explosive, so all-encompassing, that it would threaten the very survival of free trade, of globalisation, and of the market-based economy.
Good.
There would be calls for wage and price controls, punitive, ultra-progressive taxes, a war on the city," meaning London,
the London banks,
and arbitrary jail sentences.
Arbitrary.
For fear of allowing extremist or populist parties through the door, mainstream politicians would end up adopting much of this agenda with devastating implications for our, meaning the bankers, long-term prosperity. And he referred to the shift that happened after the 1929 crash in the 1930s in the United States, and also referred to the fact that this is the trend we're seeing now with Sanders and Trump and the victories they're seeing. So we're going to stop for a quick break, but after the break we'll talk about bail-in and where it came from. Welcome back to the CEC Report. The derivatives casino dealers who cooked up bail-in. Now, because we didn't get a return to Glass-Steagall after the 2007-08 GFC, instead we have bail-in. And we've said before on the show plenty of times that bail-in is designed to protect derivatives. Well, today we're going to show you perhaps the greatest proof of that, which is the story of the creation of bail-in. And what we'll see in particular are two protagonists who were founding members of CS First Boston, and actually their derivatives division, Paul Colello and Wilson Irvin. And there's a story about a famous or infamous weekend which occurred in the building of the New York Federal Reserve. This was during the 2008 GFC.
September 13-14 on the weekend of 2008.
And the purpose of this gathering, it pulled together some of the top bankers and fund managers and derivatives dealers in the world to come up with a means over that weekend. It was in lockdown. They were all putting their heads together to figure out how to save Lehman Brothers. Now, they didn't succeed, but they did come up with a way to address the biggest issue with the Lehman crisis, which was the unravelling of derivatives contracts, which caused contagion as they unravelled and as that spread. So this was the birth of bail-in, actually. Tell us about these people that were behind it and what their plan was.
Well, this is crucial, Elisa, because bail-in has, it came as a shock to the public in 2013 when the banks of Cyprus were bailed in, and then everyone, where did this policy come from? How can you just grab deposits to keep a bank going? Well, this is new. But because it's all post-2008, you could be forgiven for thinking that it's the academics and the analysts in the government and the central bank regulators around the world who've said, financial stability is the most important thing. We need a system to ensure financial stability. And in fact, the organisation that's in charge with enforcing bail-in is called the Financial Stability Board. So you could be forgiven for thinking it's a bureaucratic thing, right? But what we noticed straight away when we first looked at it is, hang on, they want to bail in depositors, they want to bail in the bonds that people might hold in their superannuation funds that they've been talking to buying, etc. They want to bail in all those things to keep a bank going, but they're not going to bail in the derivatives bets that banks have made. How crooked is that, right? Well, so it turns out that the two gentlemen you just mentioned, Paul Colello and Wilson Irvin from Credit Suisse First Boston, everyone credits them with the idea. And when you look at them, they are derivatives salesmen. That's their thing. Now, you've got to understand derivatives to know how significant that is. And there was probably the bank on Wall Street that pioneered derivatives was called Bankers Trust in the 80s, and it had a derivatives division. It actually went bust eventually, but in 1990, a group of the derivatives salesmen for Bankers Trust moved to Credit Suisse and started Credit Suisse Financial Products, and they were led by this guy Paul Colello, and he was joined by Wilson Irvin. So from 1990 on, they were the derivatives salesmen for Credit Suisse. This was a period, I call it the Wild Frontier days. Not that it ever changed, but in 1997, a huge public service was done by a gentleman named Frank Partnoy, who was a derivatives salesman himself, including with Credit Suisse First Boston, including with Bankers Trust, and including with Morgan Stanley. He got out in 1995. He thought, if I keep doing this, I might end up in jail. And he wrote a book called Fiasco, Blood in the Water on Wall Street, which exposed, and it gives you detail after detail of how different derivatives contracts were structured, where what you see is fundamentally these things are fraud, right? They're all about exploiting loopholes, pretending risk isn't involved, moving the risk off the books. Well, that's fraud right there. They might rationalise it away, but that's fraud right there. So you have something that on paper looks like it'll make you huge profits, right? But of course, the risk is always attached to it. There is risk there. And when it goes bad, the huge profits become huge losses, right? Derivatives are bets you make on something that's real, but these are side bets. And then the derivatives themselves can become the basis for more bets. People start making bets on the first level of derivatives. And there's a scene in The Big Short which describes this in a casino. Bets on the bets on the bets, right? This is the system. In the case of Credit Suisse, it was involved in some of the most notorious examples of this fraud while these two clowns worked there. So the biggest one was in Japan in 1999. The Japanese financial supervisors, they had to suspend Credit Suisse's license because it was selling window dressing derivatives. That's what they were called.
So they were kicked out of Japan for this, right?
Yeah. And we know the guy who did it. A gentleman that we brought to Australia, Daisuke Kotogawa, to explain derivatives to politicians in 2014 here. But these window dressing derivatives are designed to hide losses, or worse, make losses, actual losses, look like profits for a while. And he gives an example he calls it the bucket of gold, where you have a bucket of gold worth $100, but half of it is real gold and half of it is fool's gold. Now the half that's real gold is actually worth 90, and the half that's fool's gold, or not much better, is worth 10. If you sold the half that's worth 90 for 90, you don't make any money. But what you can do with derivatives is you come along and go, well, hang on, let's just average it out. We'll say the half we'll say both halves are worth 50, and we can start selling those ones that are real for 90 and record a $40 profit. Right? And we can actually say we've made a profit on that because we've just artificially devalued the price of the real gold. And you can get away with that as long as you don't sell the half that's fool's gold, right? Because then you have to realise the loss. But if you don't sell it, you park it on your books, you can get away with it, right? And you can get away with it until some financial supervisor comes along and says, that's fraud. This is the kind of thing they were doing. With these two guys cooked up, they were with that kind of background. They participated in this meeting in 2008. Here was Lehman Brothers that had $25 billion in bad assets. And that was what was sending the company bankrupt. But by declaring bankruptcy, then that $25 billion became defaults against $150 billion, which is what set off a chain reaction throughout the system. And AIG collapsed the next day, etc. And these two guys thought, if we had been able to get someone else to wear that $25 billion loss, namely their creditors and their unsuspecting customers, then if they ate that loss, then the casino could have kept going because you wouldn't have had to have these other defaults going down the line.
You'd contain it rather than causing a contagion.
No, exactly. So they wrote this up in The Economist magazine in January 2010, and then they say that the people that we've talked about on this program a lot, Mark Carney from the Financial Stability Board, who's now the chairman of the Bank of England, Paul Tuckey from the Bank of England, and a guy from the FDIC, they picked it up and ran with it, and now bail-in is law. And one other quick thing, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, which is sort of like the club for these derivatives gambling banks, they have had a big input into writing these bail-in laws.
Yeah, in the case of Cyprus, they did that. And of course the G20 picked up this proposal, creating the Financial Stability Board, which is Mark Carney, to run with this, and that's why Australia and other countries that are member nations are going along with it too. So that was in 2009. Yeah,
so the people who came up with the idea that say you're going to lose your savings and you're going to lose your retirement savings, so a bank can go, but their gambling bets have to be paid out, are the gamblers themselves.
So it's all to save derivatives. So we'll stop there, but after the break we're going to talk about an explicit example of this in New Zealand. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing the derivatives casino dealers who cooked up bail-in. And this week's Australian Alert Service has a full feature on this. If you call in to get a free copy, you can read more about what we're discussing today. And in particular, right now, we're going to talk about one of the articles therein, which is titled "New Zealand is Australia's Back Door for Bail-in." And in this article, Robert, you describe the New Zealand bail-in regime is the most blatant and ruthless deposit stealing scheme in the world. Give us an idea of why that's the case.
Okay, because every other bail-in regime in place, US, UK, EU, etc., they say, yes, we're going to do this, but we only, under certain conditions, and, there's a certain part of your deposits are guaranteed, right? New Zealand doesn't pretend any of that. They say no deposits are guaranteed. It's your savings that are going to go, and they have these charts. They illustrate it. Anyway, from the beginning, they've been illustrating this since 2011. But right now on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's website, you can see this image. They've got this full colour illustration of their bail-in scheme. Right, it's called Open Bank Resolution, and they show a cliff with a fence, and the fence is bank regulation. But if you fall off the cliff, then the traditional route is liquidation, where the bank gets closed, and once everything's sorted out, you may get your money back. And they say, we can have open bank resolution where the bank stays open.
There's a detour.
There's a detour over a weekend.
Yeah.
They sort everything out, and down the end it says, resolution of issues completed. The unused portion of frozen money is returned to customers. So the unused portion, they're admitting they're going to use your money.
In a bail-in.
Yeah, in a bail-in, to keep that bank going. Only the unused portion will be returned. But because there's no there's no deposit guarantee, they're not saying they're not going to use the whole lot. If they have to, they'll use the whole lot, right? Now, first of all, there's only one thing missing from this lovely illustration, Elisa, and that's the sheep, the carcasses of sheep piled up at the bottom of the cliff. And the occasional one who may have gone to the end of the path there, fully fleeced, right? That's the New Zealand system. Why we call it the back door for bail in Australia is because New Zealand's banks are Australia's banks. The four big New Zealand banks are subsidiaries of Australia's big four banks, right? And therefore, they have the same exposure to the derivatives that Australia's big four banks have. And for all I know, and we'll confirm this, but New Zealand, I'm sure, under the investment banker Prime Minister John Key, would have their own exposure to derivatives, because this is a brave new world of the system. So it's a double whammy, really. Australians would be exposed to the derivatives of our big four banks plus their New Zealand subsidiary derivatives, and vice versa, right? And if here's Australia, where we're told by APRA, the banking regulator here, no, we won't have statutory bail-in where it's legislated you can lose your savings. We won't do that. And as we said last week, Chris Bowen said we don't support that. But Australians have to take stock. All the countries we're closest to, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada and New Zealand, have bail-in, openly have bail-in where they take deposits. New Zealand's the worst, where they say we're going to take all deposits, right, if we have to. There's no guarantee on any deposits. They're the countries we're closest to. They're our banks in New Zealand, and we want to kid ourselves that these authorities like APRA, which is a fascist extra parliamentary authority, right, that represents the Bank for International Settlements in Australia, they will do what they have to do to keep the system going. They will bail us in a heartbeat.
And the only reason that we don't have explicit bail-in laws here is because of the massive campaign and the attention that we drew to it through 2013, 2014, which it would have put the politicians in the real hot seat had they gone ahead with it. So they've had to basically go ahead and do it by stealth.
But we've got contractual bail-in, which is bail-inable bonds, which they're selling like mad, and Commonwealth Bank issued more of them this week.
So you can read more about this in the Australian Alert Service. You need to go to your politician, go to all your local leaders and fight for Glass-Steagall, because this is the most straightforward way to actually make banks
Most
safe.
politicians, Elisa, would know about Glass-Steagall because we've been running this campaign. Rub their face in it. If they're still saying it doesn't apply, don't let them get away with it. More and more voices around the world are saying it. If we do it before things go pear-shaped, then it will protect us. If we do it afterwards, then we have to clean up the mess.
Yeah. So that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks for joining us, Robert, and tune in again to the CEC Report next week.